Imagine yourself standing in a desolate, barren valley. The ground is strewn with countless dry and dusty bones, bleached white by the relentless sun. There is no sound, not even the gentle rustling of a breeze, just an eerie silence that seems to echo with hopelessness. The air is thick with the weight of despair, and every direction you turn, there is nothing but emptiness. The ground is cracked, parched by the sun's relentless heat, and the very air seems to pulse with a heavy stillness. In this scene of utter desolation, God is about to reveal something extraordinary, a message that speaks not only to the people of ancient Israel, but also to each one of us today. The prophet Ezekiel, far from his homeland and living in exile, stood in such a valley. His people, the Israelites, had been conquered and taken captive to Babylon. They had lost everything they held dear, their homes, families, and even their place of worship, the sacred temple. It was a time of immense sorrow, and many believed that their relationship with God was forever severed. They were like those dry bones in the valley, lifeless, hopeless, and forgotten. It seemed as though the promise of God's covenant had crumbled into dust, leaving only despair and regret in its wake. Ezekiel, like his people, must have felt the weight of hopelessness pressing on him. The once vibrant community of Israel, full of dreams and promise, now lay shattered. Families were torn apart, their sacred temple was reduced to ruins, and their identity as God's chosen people seemed like a distant memory. The Valley of Dry Bones was more than just a physical location. It was a powerful symbol of the spiritual and emotional state of the people. Everything they had once held dear was gone, and the future seemed bleak and uncertain. They felt abandoned, cut off from the source of their identity, and their hearts echoed the emptiness of the valley. The imagery of dry bones scattered across the valley was not just a vision of death, it was a representation of the complete and utter devastation that Israel felt. The bones were dry, stripped of any flesh or sinew, bleached by time and neglect, a stark reminder of how far they had fallen. They were the remnants of what once was, people with dreams, hopes, and aspirations. Each bone told a story of a life that once held promise, now reduced to nothing but a fragment of a past existence. It was then, amidst this overwhelming despair, that God chose to act. Ezekiel suddenly felt the powerful presence of God upon him, and before he knew it, he found himself transported to a vast valley filled with bones. These bones, scattered across the ground, seemed to represent the total hopelessness that gripped the hearts of his people. They were a vivid symbol of everything lost, dreams shattered, families torn apart, and faith that had withered away. But God had something incredible in store, and he was about to teach Ezekiel, and all of us, a profound lesson about his power to restore and renew. In the stillness of that valley, God asked Ezekiel a seemingly impossible question. "Son of man, can these bones live?" The very question seemed to defy logic and nature. Bones that had been left to decay for who knows how long, could they really come back to life? Most people would have answered with a firm no, but Ezekiel knew better. He had seen God do amazing things before. He knew that God was not bound by human limitations. And so, instead of doubting, he replied wisely, "Lord, only you know." Ezekiel's response holds a powerful lesson for us. How often do we look at the challenges in our lives, broken relationships, unfulfilled dreams, or circumstances that seem beyond repair, and conclude that there is no hope? We see the dry bones of our lives and assume that restoration is impossible. We see the ruins of what once was, and it's easy to believe that nothing can be done. But just as God asked Ezekiel whether the bones could live, he also asks us to see beyond our limitations and believe in his limitless power. It is a challenge to look beyond what our eyes can see and trust in the unseen power of God. God then gave Ezekiel a surprising command. "Prophesy to these bones, and say to them, 'Dry bones, hear the word of the Lord.'" Imagine the scene. Ezekiel, standing in a valley full of bones, speaking to them as though they could hear. To an outsider, this must have seemed utterly absurd. A lone man, in the midst of death and desolation, speaking to bones that had long since lost any sign of life. The dry, brittle bones lay scattered, unmoving, lifeless. But Ezekiel didn't hesitate. He spoke God's words over the bones, and as he did, something miraculous happened. The bones began to rattle and move, connecting with one another. It was as if an invisible force was assembling them, femur to pelvis, rib to spine, until entire skeletons were formed. The sound must have been both eerie and awe-inspiring. The rattling of bones echoed through the valley, breaking the silence that had hung so heavily over the scene. The bones moved, shifting, sliding, coming together as if directed by an unseen hand. The dry, dusty ground that had once been still and silent was now alive with motion. Bone joined to bone, each one finding its proper place, forming skeletons where moments before there had been only disarray. It was as though hope itself was being pieced back together, one bone at a time, and it didn't stop there. Muscles, tendons, and skin began to grow, covering the bones until complete bodies lay across the valley floor. What had been dry and lifeless was now whole and formed. Yet despite the amazing transformation, something crucial was still missing: the breath of life. These bodies, though now complete in form, were still without life. They were whole, yet lifeless, like statues carved from flesh. It was a powerful reminder that without God's Spirit, even what appears whole is incomplete. This transformation was not instantaneous. It happened in stages, each more incredible than the last. First, there was the sound, the rattling of bones as they moved and connected. The noise must have echoed through the valley, a cacophony of hope, breaking through the silence of despair. Then the bones came together, forming complete skeletons. This was followed by the growth of tendons and muscles, binding the bones, and finally, the skin covered them. What was once a scattered heap of dry bones was now a valley filled with fully formed bodies. But even then, they were still lifeless, awaiting the final, most vital element. God then told Ezekiel to prophesy once more, this time to the Spirit, calling on the breath of life to enter the bodies. Ezekiel obeyed, and suddenly breath entered them. Where there had been only silence and death, there was now life. The sound of breathing, of movement, of an entire army standing on its feet. It was a powerful testament to God's ability to bring life to what seemed beyond hope. The valley that had once been a symbol of hopelessness was now filled with life, strength, and purpose. Imagine the sight. Where once there had been nothing but death, there now stood an army, alive and vibrant. The bodies that had once been lifeless were now filled with breath, their chests rising and falling, their eyes open and alert. The transformation was complete, not because of anything Ezekiel had done on his own, but because he had obeyed God's command. He had spoken God's words, and God had done the rest. It was a powerful reminder that God is the one who brings life, that He is the source of all hope and renewal. This story isn't just about a miraculous event that happened thousands of years ago. It's about the nature of God and His desire to breathe new life into our own valleys of dry bones. Whether it's a dream you've given up on, a relationship that seems irreparable, or a situation that feels utterly hopeless, God's message is clear. He can restore, rebuild, and bring new life where there seems to be none. The dry bones represent the areas in our lives that have lost all vitality, the dreams that have died, the hopes that have faded, the faith that has been shaken. And just as He did for Ezekiel, God can bring these bones back to life. The process of transformation in the valley was not instant. It happened in stages. First, the bones came together, then tendons and muscles formed, and finally, the breath of life entered. This teaches us something crucial about how God often works in our lives. Transformation is often a gradual process. We may not see immediate results, but step by step, God is working to rebuild, restore, and breathe life into us. It's easy to become discouraged when we don't see the progress we hope for right away. But Ezekiel's vision reminds us that God is always at work, even when the change is not yet visible. Imagine the patience it must have taken for Ezekiel to watch this transformation unfold. He didn't see the army rise instantly. He saw it happen one step at a time. First, the bones rattled, then they assembled, then the muscles and tendons formed, and finally the breath came. Each stage was important, and each stage brought the bones closer to life. In the same way, the changes God brings to our lives may come slowly, but each step is crucial. We may not understand why the process takes so long, but we can trust that God is working, that He is putting everything in place for the final breath of life. Sometimes God calls us to do things that seem irrational or even foolish by human standards, to forgive when it feels impossible, to trust when circumstances seem hopeless, to speak words of faith when doubt is all around. But it is in those moments of obedience, when we step out in faith despite not fully understanding, that miracles happen. Just as Ezekiel prophesied to the bones, we too are called to speak God's promises over our lives and situations. We are invited to declare life where there seems to be only death, to proclaim hope where despair reigns. It is in these moments of faith that God moves most powerfully, transforming what seemed beyond hope into something beautiful and full of life. Consider the areas of your life that feel like a valley of dry bones. Maybe it's a relationship that feels broken beyond repair, a dream you've buried because it seems impossible, or a challenge that feels insurmountable. God is asking you the same question He asked Ezekiel. Can these bones live? The answer doesn't lie in our own abilities or understanding. It lies in God's power and His desire to bring life to even the most hopeless of situations. Like Ezekiel, our response should be, Lord, only you know. This response is not one of doubt, but of faith, a recognition that God's power goes beyond our understanding, that He can do what we cannot. This story also serves as a reminder that true life comes only from God. Even after the bodies were fully formed in the valley, they remained lifeless until God's breath entered them. We can have all the outward appearances of being whole. We can do all the right things, say all the right words, but without God's Spirit, we are incomplete. It is His breath that gives us true life, that empowers us to live fully and purposefully. The breath of God is what transforms us from mere shells into beings filled with purpose, strength, and vitality. The vision of the Valley of Dry Bones is ultimately a story of hope. Hope that even in our darkest moments, God is with us, working to restore and renew. It's a story of God's relentless love, a love that refuses to leave us in despair, a love that calls us out of our graves and into new life. No matter how dry or lifeless the bones of your life may seem, God's promise is that He can and will breathe new life into them. He is not a God who leaves us in our brokenness. He is a God who restores, who takes what is shattered and makes it whole again. This hope extends to every aspect of our lives. Think of the relationships that seem irreparably broken. Just as God brought together the disconnected bones, He can bring restoration to relationships that seem beyond repair. It might take time, just as it did in the valley, but each step brings us closer to healing. The broken pieces can come together, one by one, and be covered with new life through God's grace and power. Our role is to speak life, to prophesy as Ezekiel did, believing that God is capable of transforming even the most hopeless situations. Perhaps there are dreams you have abandoned because they seemed impossible. Dreams that once brought you joy and excitement but now lie forgotten, like bones scattered across a valley. God specializes in reviving what appears to be dead. He asks us to have faith, to speak His words over our dreams, and to trust in His ability to resurrect them. What we see as dry and lifeless, God sees as an opportunity for a miracle. He is not limited by time or circumstances. He can bring life to dreams that have been dormant for years. And think of the areas in your life that feel spiritually dry. Maybe you once had a vibrant relationship with God, but over time, it has grown cold. The passion you once felt has faded, and now it feels like you are merely going through the motions. The valley of dry bones is a powerful reminder that God can breathe new life into our spiritual lives as well. He desires to fill us with His Spirit, to renew our passion and rekindle the fire within us. He wants us to experience the fullness of life that comes from walking closely with Him. Ezekiel's vision is also a reminder of the importance of obedience. Imagine if Ezekiel had looked at the bones and decided that it was pointless to speak to them. The miracle would never have happened. But Ezekiel obeyed, even when it seemed absurd, and through his obedience, God's power was revealed. In our own lives, we may face situations where God's instructions don't make sense to us. He may ask us to take a step of faith that seems illogical, or to trust Him when everything around us says otherwise. It is in those moments that our obedience becomes the key to unlocking God's miraculous power. The transformation of the bones into a living army also teaches us about the collective power of God's restoration. The bones did not come together to form just a few individuals. They formed a vast army. God's work in our lives is not only about individual restoration, but also about bringing us together as a community, as His people. We are meant to stand together, to support one another, and to be a powerful force for God's kingdom. When God breathes life into us, it is not just for our own benefit, but for the benefit of those around us. We are called to be agents of His restoration, to speak life into the lives of others, and to be a testament to His power. As we reflect on this story, let us remember that the Valley of Dry Bones is not just a story from the past. It is a present reality. We all have areas in our lives that feel dry and lifeless. But God is still in the business of restoration. He is still asking, can these bones live? And He is still inviting us to trust Him, to speak His words, and to watch as He brings life where there was once only death. The God who brought life to a valley of dry bones is the same God who is at work in our lives today. He is faithful, He is powerful, and He is able to do immeasurably more than we could ever ask or imagine. As we close this part of the story, remember that God's power to restore is not limited by our circumstances. He is not constrained by what seems possible or impossible to us. The God who brought life to a valley of dry bones can bring life to every area of your life that feels hopeless. All He asks is that we trust Him, that we be open to the possibility of a miracle, and that we, like Ezekiel, speak His words of life into our valleys. The transformation may not be immediate, but step by step, breath by breath, God will bring life, hope, and restoration. He will take the dry bones of our lives and, through His power, create something beautiful, something filled with life and purpose. The Valley of Dry Bones had been transformed into a vibrant army, full of life and purpose. But the story doesn't end there. It was just the beginning of something even greater that God was about to reveal. The breath of life that filled those bodies in the valley was not merely about physical revival. It was a powerful metaphor for the spiritual revival that God longed to bring to His people. It was a promise of restoration, of a new beginning, and an invitation to live fully in the presence and purpose of God. The breath of life is a recurring theme throughout Scripture, beginning in Genesis when God breathed life into Adam, transforming dust into a living being. This same breath brought life to the dry bones, and it represents the Spirit of God, the very presence that sustains, empowers, and gives meaning to our existence. Without God's Spirit, we are like the dry bones, whole in form but lacking the life that only He can give. True restoration begins when we allow God's Spirit to fill us, to breathe life into every corner of our being. The Spirit of God is the very essence of who we are meant to be. It is the breath that fills us with purpose, the wind that moves us toward God's plans, and the power that enables us to do what we could never do on our own. As Ezekiel witnessed the transformation of the valley, he understood that God was not merely interested in restoring Israel's physical land or their political freedom. God desired something much deeper, a restoration of their hearts, their spirits, and their relationship with Him. He wanted to breathe His Spirit into them, to transform them from the inside out. We, too, need that breath of life. So often we focus on outward appearances, on having everything put together, on doing all the right things. But God wants more than just our outward obedience. He wants our hearts. He wants to breathe His life into the places that are dry and weary, to fill us with His Spirit so that we can truly live. This is the heart of restoration. Not just a change in circumstances, but a change within us, a renewal of our spirits, a reconnection with the God who loves us. Ezekiel's vision of the dry bones coming to life is a powerful reminder that God is not content with mere survival for His people. He wants us to thrive. He wants us to experience the fullness of life that comes from knowing Him, from walking in His Spirit, from being filled with His presence. The breath that entered the bones in the valley was the same breath that hovered over the waters at creation, the same breath that filled the apostles at Pentecost, the same breath that fills us today when we open our hearts to Him. The vision also speaks to the power of hope. When Ezekiel saw the valley of bones, it was a picture of utter hopelessness. But God saw potential. Where others saw death, God saw life. Where others saw despair, God saw an opportunity for a miracle. This is the nature of God. He specializes in bringing hope to the hopeless, life to the lifeless, and joy to the joyless. He is the God of resurrection, the God who brings beauty from ashes, the God who turns mourning into dancing. And He invites us to see our lives through His eyes, to look beyond what seems impossible and believe in the power of His restoration. Consider the challenges you are facing right now. Perhaps there are areas in your life that feel like a valley of dry bones, areas where hope seems lost, where you have given up on the possibility of change. God is inviting you to trust Him, to believe that He can bring life where there is death, to hold on to hope even when everything around you seems hopeless. He is the same God who brought life to that valley, and He is still in the business of miracles today. No situation is too far gone for Him. No dream too dead, no heart too broken. The story of the Valley of Dry Bones is also a call to action. God asked Ezekiel to speak to the bones, to prophesy to them, to declare His words over them. And it was through Ezekiel's obedience that the miracle took place. In the same way, God calls us to speak life into the situations around us. He asks us to declare His promises, to speak His truth, to prophesy to the dry bones in our own lives. This is not about ignoring reality or pretending that everything is fine. It is about choosing to believe in God's power, choosing to declare His truth even when our circumstances say otherwise. Speaking life means choosing faith over fear, hope over despair, and truth over lies. It means declaring God's promises over our lives, even when we don't see them yet. It means trusting that God is at work, even when we can't see it. Just as Ezekiel spoke to the bones, we are called to speak to the areas of our lives that feel dry and lifeless. We are called to declare God's promises over our families, our dreams, our futures. We are called to believe that the God who brought life to the valley of dry bones can bring life to every area of our lives. Imagine the courage it took for Ezekiel to stand in that valley and speak to the bones. He was surrounded by death, by hopelessness, by evidence of what had been lost. Yet he chose to trust God's word over what his eyes could see. He chose to believe that God's power was greater than the death that surrounded him. and because of his obedience, he witnessed a miracle. In the same way, we are called to trust God's word over our circumstances, to believe that his power is greater than anything we are facing, and to speak life even when it seems impossible. God's question to Ezekiel, "Can these bones live?" is a question he asks each of us. It is an invitation to believe in the impossible, to trust in his power to restore and renew. It is a reminder that nothing is beyond his reach, that no situation is too far gone for him. And it is a call to action, a call to speak life, to declare his promises, to trust in his power to bring restoration. The answer to that question is not found in our own abilities or understanding. It is found in God. He alone knows, and he alone has the power to bring life where there is death. The transformation of the valley was not just about physical restoration, it was about spiritual revival. The breath of life that entered the bodies was a symbol of God's Spirit, a reminder that true life comes only from him. Without his Spirit, we are like the bodies in the valley, whole in form, but lacking the breath that gives us life. True restoration begins when we allow God's Spirit to fill us, to breathe life into every corner of our being, to transform us from the inside out. This is what God desires for each of us, that we would not only be restored outwardly, but that we would be filled with his Spirit, that we would experience the fullness of life that comes from knowing him. He wants to breathe his life into our dreams, our relationships, our faith. He wants to fill us with his presence, to empower us to live fully and purposefully. The breath of God is what transforms us from mere shells into beings filled with purpose, strength, and vitality. The vision of the Valley of Dry Bones is ultimately a story of God's relentless love, a love that refuses to leave us in despair, a love that calls us out of our graves and into new life. No matter how dry or lifeless the bones of your life may seem, God's promise is that he can and will breathe new life into them. He is not a God who leaves us in our brokenness. He is a God who restores, who takes what is shattered and makes it whole again. Think of the relationships in your life that need restoration. Perhaps there are people you have been estranged from, relationships that have been broken for so long that they seem beyond repair. Just as God brought together the scattered bones in the valley, he can bring restoration to relationships that seem hopeless. It may not happen overnight, but step by step, God can bring healing. He can bring forgiveness where there has been bitterness, understanding where there has been conflict, and love where there has been hurt. Our role is to speak life, to pray for restoration, to trust that God is able to do what we cannot. Perhaps there are dreams that you have given up on. Dreams that once brought you joy and excitement but now seem impossible. God is inviting you to believe again, to trust that he can bring life to those dreams. He is not limited by time or circumstances. He can bring life to dreams that have been dormant for years. He asks us to have faith, to speak his promises over our dreams, and to trust in his ability to bring them to life. What we see as dry and lifeless, God sees as an opportunity for a miracle, and then there is our spiritual life. There are times when our relationship with God feels dry, when the passion we once had has faded, and our faith feels more like going through the motions than a vibrant connection with the Creator. The Valley of Dry Bones is a reminder that God can breathe new life into our spirits as well. He desires to fill us with his Spirit, to renew our passion, to rekindle the fire within us. He wants us to experience the fullness of life that comes from walking closely with him, from being filled with his presence. Ezekiel's vision also teaches us about the power of community. The bones did not come together to form isolated individuals. They formed a vast army. God's restoration is not just about individual renewal, but about bringing us together as his people, as a community. We are not meant to walk this journey alone. We are meant to stand together, to support one another, to be a powerful force for God's kingdom. When God breathes life into us, It is not just for our own benefit, but for the benefit of those around us. We are called to be agents of His restoration, to speak life into the lives of others, to stand together as a community of faith. The breath of life that entered the bodies in the valley was a symbol of God's Spirit, a reminder that true life comes only from Him. It is His Spirit that fills us, that empowers us, that gives us the strength to live fully and purposefully. Without His Spirit, we are incomplete. We may have all the outward appearances of being whole, but we lack the true life that only He can give. God desires to fill us with His Spirit, to breathe His life into every corner of our being, to transform us from the inside out. As we close this part of the story, let us remember that God is still in the business of restoration. He is still breathing life into dry bones, still bringing hope to the hopeless, still turning graves into gardens. He is inviting us to trust Him, to speak life, to declare His promises, to believe in His power to restore. The transformation may not be immediate, but step by step, breath by breath, God is at work. He is taking the dry bones of our lives and through His power creating something beautiful, something filled with life and purpose. So, as you stand in your own valley, surrounded by dry bones, whether they are broken relationships, abandoned dreams, or a weary spirit, remember that God is not done. He is still speaking, still moving, still breathing life. The bones may be dry, but they are not beyond His reach. Trust in Him, speak His words, and watch as He brings life where there was once only death. Step by step, moment by moment, God is working to restore, to rebuild, and to bring new life. And just as Ezekiel witnessed the transformation of the valley, you too will see the power of God at work in your life, turning despair into hope, death into life, and brokenness into beauty. The Valley of Dry Bones was not just a miraculous event, but a prophetic promise for us all. It tells us that no matter how hopeless a situation may seem, God is able to bring renewal and restoration. His breath, His Spirit, is always there, ready to revive us. This vision speaks to us in our weakest moments when we feel as if we are surrounded by emptiness. When we are spiritually dry, we need to trust in God's unfailing power to breathe life into our hearts and bring transformation. We must also remember the importance of participating in God's plan. Ezekiel was not a passive observer, he was an active participant in the miracle. God commanded him to speak, and through his words the bones came together, and breath entered them. In the same way, God asks us to take part in the restoration process. It may be a word of encouragement, a prayer, an act of kindness, or standing in faith when others have given up. These acts may seem small or insignificant, but God can use them in miraculous ways to bring about change. Ezekiel's vision also shows us that God's work in our lives is not always immediate. The bones first came together, then the sinews and flesh formed, and finally, breath entered. Restoration often happens in stages. We may not see the entire picture at once, but each step is part of God's greater plan. It is essential for us to be patient and trust that God is working even when the progress is slow or not visible. His timing is perfect, and every stage is crucial for the complete work He wants to accomplish in us. The army that rose from the valley was not just a group of individuals, but a united force. This speaks to the importance of community and collective strength. God's Spirit unites us, and together we are stronger. When we allow God to breathe life into us, we become part of something greater than ourselves. We are called to be a light to the world, to bring hope to others, and to stand together in faith.